Hello everyone, it's PokePhenomenal and we're making a tier list.
Shocking, I know.
Yeah, we are getting it on the ground level of this, but we've decided that we want to start a series of videos where we make tier lists of different Pokemon games from a Nuzlocker's perspective. So given Fire Red and Leaf Green is kind of our specialty, we decided to start with Fire Red and Leaf Green, and we want to talk about the gym leaders, their relative difficulty, things like that from the perspective of people who have played this game way too much. So in terms of how we're going to do it, first we want to talk about the type, so we'll take a perspective, the type of the gym itself, the team that the gym is running, the encounters that you have available to you as a player when you reach that gym, and then after that we'll kind of just talk about the general difficulty, the strategies that you can take in, basically anything from that point. So we'll go in order. And I think that it's just time to start. You ready, Mike?
Yep.
So number one is Brock. So starting with Brock, his type. So he's a rock. What is it? Rock ground. I mean rock type generally.
Yeah, rock type, but rock ground.
So Brock is a weird one because rock ground is like, it's a really exploitable type, right? But at that point in the game, unless you got Squirtle, you don't. The Squirtle and Bulbasaur can exploit it, but that's kind of the main thing you have to exploit the type itself. I guess you get Mankey, right? Like, you can get Mankey.
Yeah, like at this point in the game, you don't have a lot of coverage, so rock can be a difficult first gym leader type.
Like, as a type, I mean, it's almost a 50-50 in terms of your encounters, right? Because you can get, before Brock, either a grass or a water type, or you get Metal Claw and Charmander. No matter what, your starter is giving you something to counteract Brock. But then with your encounters, it's really just up to your encounter luck. In terms of the type, like, are you going to get the fighting type? Or are you going to get even a neutral type? Like, with bad enough luck, you can end up getting almost entirely weak types to this gym. So, I think the typing, I would give it maybe, like, I'm pretty neutral on it. Like, it can be tough, but it can also be really simple. So, I don't really think the typing is giving Brock that much of an advantage either way.
Yeah, I'd agree.
But if we look at his actual team, he's got the Geodude and the Onix. And, like, they kind of tie into type, right? Like, do you have something that can counteract that?
Like, yeah, their biggest advantage is their type and their resistances, because Geodude is a pretty decent Pokemon. Onix is obviously a very bad Pokemon in terms of its stats. So his actual team, the Geodude is the only real threat if you don't have an answer.
I guess what we could say about the Onix, though, is that it has such a high defense that with your encounters, you could end up getting almost entirely physical attackers.
True.
If you got Charmander, Metal Claw is hitting for physical. So even though it's super effective, like let's say you have the Rattata, a Pidgey, a Spearow, a Beedrill, like almost all of your moves are hitting for physical. So I think Onix can become a pretty defensive tank. But even then, like a Rattata can do pretty decent damage.
Yeah, there's also the potential for, I guess, bind becoming an issue.
Right, like how defensively capable is your own team? So I think like Onix, Geodude is definitely like, he goes down quickly, but I think he does do more damage if he's hitting you. But like the Onix has a higher level, it has the high defense. Like it can still pose a problem. It really does depend on your team, so I guess we should talk about encounters.
Yeah, so
I mean, like we said, like your best encounters outside of your starter. I mean, if you get Bulbasaur or Squirtle, he's pretty much free. So depending on if you allow yourself to pick your starter, Brock might just be a totally free gym, like a totally free gym. But if you're randomizing it and if you get Charmander, like it does become a little more difficult because, like I said, you can get a Pidgey or a Rattata on Route 1. You can get the Weedle. Like the Caterpie is a good encounter. If you can get the Caterpie, you get Confusion. You can potentially get Sleep Powder depending on how you do the leveling and how your level caps work. So like Caterpie is good, but it's still not perfect because it's also weak to Rock Tomb. And there are a lot of good Pokemon that you can encounter before Brock, but you are not guaranteed any of them. I think that's the main problem, right? Like,
yeah, like there is diversity. I think I agree that the starters definitely minimalize this fight. Like you said, Bulbasaur and Squirtle basically make it a free fight. Charmander's a little bit more iffy just because of Metal Claw and physical attack. But you obviously will struggle if you're relying on, a Pidgey and a Rattata and even a Beedrill. But the Butterfree's a decent encounter just because of confusion and the special defense, and Mankey obviously for the fighting type, and even like a Nidoran, because I believe Nidoran should get double kick by that point, so that's another fighting move. So
right,
there definitely are decent encounters for this.
I think there are more beneficial encounters than non-beneficial encounters, just slightly.
Yeah.
Like you're likely to get something that's going to counter Brock. Like it's really exceptionally bad luck if you don't, because you essentially have to get the Pidgey, the Rattata, the Weedle, the Spearow, and like even potentially like the Pikachu. Like
yeah.
there's a lot has to go wrong for you to be in a situation where you have no counter to Brock. So I think that's one point in, like, to the player's benefit. You're almost always going to have something that's going to help you with the fight, and then you can clean up with the rest of the encounters that you have. It might not be the prettiest fight, but like you should make it through in most cases. So like in general, I mean, like you said, bind is an issue. If we're talking about the overall fight, bind is an issue if you can't switch out and if you just get locked in on a Pokemon that you can't afford to lose. And the speed drop is an issue from Rock Tomb. So there are some things that Brock does that makes it a little iffy. It can make it questionable and if you're going to be able to go through, but it's all so luck-based. Like, everything has to go wrong for you. Like, I really think you're beating Brock 8 times out of 10 on a normal Nuzlocke. And normally you're beating him with no losses. So if I could, like, you know, taking all that into account, I'm feeling a B tier for Brock. Like, I'm not sure if I can justify to myself putting him higher than that, even with the fact that he can wipe your team. Like, it's so situational. You're usually going to be beating him, I think.
Yeah, I think that's pretty accurate. I think, yeah, just, I mean, with the starters alone, like, you have a 2 out of 3, you're almost guaranteed to win. You're more likely than not going to have at least, like, one other, like, decent encounter for his fight, whether it's the Mankey, the Butterfree, even the Nidoran, so, yeah, I think more often than not, Brock's a pretty easy fight, so, yeah, I think he fits well in the middle.
Okay, so we have Brock in B tier, and then if we move on to Misty, Misty is horrifying.
Yeah.
Misty is absolutely terrifying, and I feel like she has no right to be. But if we're talking about type exclusively, I mean, water type is good, and the Starmie has the benefit of just, she gets the psychic type defensively. And, like, if you have a good grass type with the Bulbasaur, Misty is pretty easy, but you don't have the benefit here of, like, 2 out of 3 starters being perfect and 1 being neutral. Like, really, it is only the Ivysaur that's good. Like, you could use the War Turtle, but it's not really helping you all that much, you know?
Yeah, like water, at this point in the game, water's a pretty powerful type. Just because, yeah, like Ivysaur's definitely the best for this. War Turtle's mixed and Charmeleon's obviously bad. You do have access to, you know, potentially the Bellsprout or the Oddish for a grass type, which is decent, and then the only other real effective type would be, you know, the early Pikachu, which is such a rarity. But yeah, like, the typing alone is a little bit difficult just at this spot of the game, just because you really only have, well, I guess technically you can also get the Paris and Mount Moon.
Right, if you do Mount Moon correctly, there is the possibility of a Paris at this point too. I'm not sure how many people are actually going out of their way to get a Paris.
Yeah.
But type-wise, water's tough. I think in a lot of situations, you're coming into this totally normally. You haven't gamed the system. Maybe if this is your first Nuzlocke, you're probably coming into Misty with a lot of neutral types. So I think that's what makes it so dangerous, is that a lot of times you're fighting Misty just at neutral, and Starmie is really strong.
Yeah.
But if we look at the encounters, we look at her team, I mean, you know, Starmie and Staryu. Staryu is not really an issue. It's really just Starmie. Starmie hits you with a water pulse and he gets the confusion, because, like, it's probably going to outspeed a lot of your Pokemon.
Yeah, it's fast. The Style Water Pulse is scary.
And you do have the option of the Person Berry that you can pick up outside of Mount Moon, but even then, like, if you're just taking neutral damage and you're not doing enough damage, and she's able to heal up, like, you're probably going to get confused more than once. But in terms of the encounters, there's also the split. Like, if you're playing with level caps, a lot of times by the time you get to Misty, you're already near her level, and you might not be able to risk even going through Nugget Bridge to go up and get another grass encounter.
Yeah, and there's also, yeah, the risk of progressing, like, through the rival fight and the trainers on the Nugget Bridge. So, like, you know, there is a risk to going for that not even guaranteed grass type. It's like, you might be better off just going straight to Misty.
Yeah, like, do you want to risk a potentially difficult rival fight an entire line of trainers that you have to fight just to get the chance at a grass type that you have to train up. A lot of times you're going to want to just go into Misty, and I think a lot of people will, and that kind of impacts the difficulty. But Misty's interesting just because, like, if you have the right team, she's not all that hard, but like even if you have a neutral team, she becomes really difficult, and it's very RNG based. The type is good, the encounters are kind of half and half, and Starmie is just really strong, so that you can get a lot of unfortunate wipes to Misty, and sometimes there's nothing that you can do about it. I mean, for me, that makes me lean like top of A, bottom of S is what I'm feeling.
Yeah, I think I can make the case for, like, I think S is appropriate. Like, I definitely think top of A at the very least.
Right, like there's no way she's lower than A.
Yeah.
And I think, like, even thinking about all the future gym leaders, like, you have options by that point. Misty, you might not have options. There's never a guarantee.
I think the biggest factor with Misty is just the fact that even compared to Brock, you don't really have a great answer from her aside from the Ivysaur. And even that can be it's not a guarantee, just given, the fact that the Starmie's faster and confusion, and I think Vine Whip may not always kill in one hit, depending.
Right, it always depends on your Ivysaur.
And so I think just the fact alone that, like, even your best option isn't really even like a safe option just shows like how difficult she can be at this point of the game.
Right, like I think it is just a combination of limited resources and a pretty difficult encounter. I guess we can put her in S. I think we can give Misty a solid S tier. Like, she might not be the hardest overall, but she can be. Like, that's the thing.
I mean, she's a very clear roadblock.
Yeah, like Misty is something that you have to overcome.
Yeah.
And a lot of times you can't. She can sit comfortably in S tier, in my opinion.
I agree.
So moving on to Surge. What do we have to say about him?
Well, obviously the electric type is a great type because it only has one weakness.
But you also have access to multiple ground types.
Yes. Well, I think, just from talking about the type purely alone.
From the type's perspective, electric is an amazing type. Like, it's not only that it only has that one weakness, it's hitting multiple types, probably some of which you already have on your team, for super effective damage. So all of those birds you brought with you are nullified. If you started with the War Turtle, he's nullified. Like, Surge is the first gym where you go against it, and it is really, like, there are some things that you almost just can't use. There are types that if you bring them in, like, it just becomes a liability, and you have to go in knowing that they're going to be fodder. Like, they're not coming in to actually be effective against Surge. They're coming in to be a warm body.
Yeah.
And I think out of pretty much all of the gym leaders' types, like, Surge's is the least exploitable. If we're to take it just as a type, of course there's the Dugtrio, but if we're taking it just from a type perspective, outside of like the Elite Four members, if we're looking at the 8 gym leaders, maybe Brock is a little less exploitable because of lack of options. But like, electric is just a tough type to get over if you don't know what you're going for. Because I can even see a situation, if this is your first Nuzlocke, you might just go into Surge and not actually think about the team composition. You go into Surge and you think, well, I should be able to beat him with the team that I have now, and then he just runs a train over your entire team. But that type of thing can happen too. So like, Surge I think is deceptively difficult. And if we're talking about his team, Raichu is horrifying.
Yeah.
Because you not only get... I can't say much about the Pikachu and the Voltorb on their own are not all that scary, but the Pikachu has double team.
Yeah. No, I will say that, up to this point, like, Surge has a pretty decent team. It's not crazy, but obviously the Raichu is the scary mon with double team and speed, but also all three of them have Shockwave, which never misses, which, is a potential thing. And also the Voltorb has Sonic Boom, so that can even nullify,
that is very
the Diglett.
scary.
So, like, even with a good Pokemon, even with the best Pokemon you could use, the Diglett at this point against him, like, even the Voltorb poses a threat.
Right, there are a lot of situations against Surge where you came in with a good team and he just didn't care.
Yeah.
Because if the Voltorb can do anything to your ground type, he can set up double teams, and from there it's just, you're flipping a coin. And if we're to talk about encounters, I mean, the shining example of encounters for this gym is you get a Diglett. 99% of the time you're coming in here with a Diglett because the cave is right there. And unless you get really unlucky encountering the Dugtrio and have to kill it to survive, chances are you're going into Surge with a Diglett on your team. And Diglett is good. Like, even if you can't evolve it because of level caps, Diglett can, on its own, handle Surge's entire team if you have good luck.
Yeah, like just, Diglett's speed and stab magnitude, like it can definitely carry the fight.
I think the biggest difficulty is that, one, if you're playing Fire Red, you lose access to the Sandshrew. So you can have like a stab dig Sandshrew on your team as well by this point if you're playing Leaf Green. So it does give Surge becomes a little, because there's a good chance you're getting a Sandshrew or a Sandslash on your team if you're playing Leaf Green. You just have enough chances at it that it's likely to happen. But in Fire Red, you don't have that. So like, there is the possibility of you just coming in here, and the best two Pokemon that you have are your Diglett and maybe one Pokemon that you taught Dig, whether it be Eradicate or your starter. Like, no matter what it is, you get one Dig and one Diglett, and that's about it.
Yeah, like the only other potential option would be Geodude.
Right, yeah, you can have the Geodude from Mount Moon.
Which, isn't guaranteed.
There are plenty of situations where you go into Surge and you have one answer to him. Like, if you have the War Turtle, like maybe you have like a Mega Kick War Turtle, a Dig Raticate, and a Diglett, and like that's your front line. And like that's not great in every circumstance. Like, things can definitely go wrong with that composition. So I think if we take that into account and we go into the fight, I mean, the fight is a total coin flip. If he gets double teams off, like literally anything can happen. Yeah, I mean, your strategy can just go out the window.
Paralysis is also a big issue. I'm pretty sure Shockwave can paralyze, but just static.
Right, if you don't kill it and you get paralyzed, like even your ground types can get paralyzed, and if you lose your ground type, like anybody can be paralyzed theoretically. And it's just, any special attacker that you're going to have at this point is not really going to be great outside of maybe Ember on the Charmeleon. Like, all the other special attacking moves you're going to be using, the Pokemon that's using those moves is probably going to be a liability to your team. So the Surge can have a lot of unexpected difficulty in that things can go wrong very quickly and everything can snowball out of control. So if we were to look at like a rank for Surge, I'm feeling a solid A tier.
Yeah.
Just because of how easily he can wreck everything that you've brought in against him.
Yeah, I think he's similar to Misty. I don't think he's as difficult as Misty, just because the Diglett, even compared to the Ivysaur against Misty, the Diglett really can carry you through Surge. But yeah, just the fact that the Diglett is kind of the best answer, especially if you don't have like the Geodude. Just the fact that there's so many other factors to this fight that make it so much worse for you. Just the double team strats, the paralysis. The fact that the Voltorb has Sonic Boom as a counter. Yeah, I think he's definitely worthy of an A tier, because like even if you're prepared, he can still wipe you.
Right, he has plenty of options, and there's no team you can bring against him that is totally safe. Like, he can take out any team that you could possibly build at this point in the Nuzlocke. So I think like if there was a more consistent like second ground type, I might knock him down into B. Like, I think he might be B sometimes in the case where you have a Sandslash, you have a Diglett, you have maybe like an Ivysaur to just tank hits. He can be a B, but that's not always going to be the case, and I think that settles him pretty solidly in A tier. So moving on to Erica, I don't think there's as much to say for her personally. I'm not sure where you stand on that, Mike.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Right, like at this point, I mean, if we talk about her type first off, Grass is a really neutral type, I think. It has some stuff going for it, but it also has a lot of really exploitable weaknesses. You're going to have flying types, you're almost definitely going to have fire types. Like, there's not a lot that's going to stop you just from a type perspective. Like, you should be able to build your team around fighting Erica at this point in the game.
You're bound to have at least one flying type, if not multiple, with Pidgeotto, Pharaoh. You could still have the Butterfree or the Beedrill for Bug. You can get the Doduo, even like the Zubat, the Golbat, like with Poison flying for like a double resistance. And obviously, the Charmeleon and either Vulpix or Growlithe, and you can get the Firestone and Zeldon, so you can get the second Evo. So you're bound to have a lot of options for Erica.
There's a lot in your favor, so I don't think we can say that the type is probably not going to be a huge consideration to you. So her type is not going to preclude any kind of strategy. And if we look at her team, Tangela, while better than you'd think, is not really ever going to be a huge threat. I mean, it can ingrain and it can stall out if you're in a really bad situation, but even getting to that situation, has to be some kind of act of God. Like, if you come in with a Fearow, even just a Fearow, but if you have a Fearow and one other effective type, it should not be that difficult of a gym battle. And again, in terms of encounters, I mean, you've got almost a guaranteed fire type with 2 roots to shoot for it, with the Growlithe or the Vulpix, and then a Firestone if you want to evolve it. You can potentially have the Charmeleon. You're going to have a flying type. And Dupe's Claws just makes it even more likely that you're going to be able to get a flying type to specifically counter Erica. And even just the layout of her gym, you have to fight 2 people and then you fight her. Her level is not that crazy high, and the options that she has I don't think are really that scary. So like you go in there, I mean we didn't mention, you get access to Fly, the move, before fighting Erica. So the game is essentially throwing options at you at this point. Unless you go in with no plan whatsoever or get really, really unlucky with paralysis or something like that.
Yeah.
Like, Erica is not going to be that difficult for you.
You also have the potential through the game corner to get Flamethrower and Ice Beam even.
Right. If you really want to, like, that's a possibility.
Yeah, like you said, like, at this point, like, the game gives you a lot to deal with Erica specifically.
So I think that, I mean, really taking that into account, like, there's really little to stop you once you're on Erica. So I'm thinking it's an easy C tier.
Yeah, I agree. Her Pokemon aren't particularly threatening, like you said. I think ultimately, like, the threat of any gym leader is bad luck, and you know, if things go really wrong, I mean, you can just wipe to any trainer. But for Erica, like, the worst condition you can be in against her is like a stall tactic, where like she, paralyzes you and like
restores health.
Yeah, it restores health. It uses Giga Drain to heal. That's like the only real chance she has of being a threat to you. But otherwise, you know, you're bound to have plenty of type options. You're likely to have a pretty powerful move at this point with just Fly alone. So I think compared to the previous 3, like there isn't at this point in the game there just isn't really a lot to like make Erica that threatening, unless short of just really bad luck.
Yeah, and I think honestly, like looking at all the gym leaders, I think Erica is probably the easiest of all of them.
Yeah,
and
that's
I mean,
fair.
we have played how many runs of this game, and I think we've only seen one person lose a Pokemon to Erica. So given that, I think Erica is probably really the easiest one that you're going to run into in this game, and I think she's pretty solid C tier for me. So if we move on to Koga, we're going to position Koga as the next gym leader because it feels right. How are we feeling about Koga, Mike?
Poison is interesting.
Poison is kind of a bad type.
Yeah, it's not great. Well, obviously, like, it doesn't have great, like, offensive capability.
Right, Poison has really weak offensive capabilities and honestly pretty weak defensive capabilities in this context.
Yeah.
Like, you can stall with a Poison type, but it's not really resisting. Like, there's a lot of common types that it's also just not resisting.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest threat with the Poison type isn't necessarily the type itself. It's the status effect of Poison,
right,
and Toxic specifically.
Like, I think if we're looking just purely at type, like, Poison is very neutral because it's not it is kind of a bad type, but in this context, it's not horrible. His Pokemon are tanky enough that he's getting use out of Poison. If he poisons you, he's going to be able to kind of stall out and attempt to just go for a victory through Poison and just drain you of all of your HP. So Poison is okay, but like I said, it doesn't resist a lot of basic types. Like, at this point, you're going to have Surf, you're going to have Strength. You're going to have a lot of really strong moves on neutral types that you can potentially be hitting for stab. So you're getting boosted damage, and he really can't do anything about that because he's not resisting any of those types. He does, at the very least, cut out his ground weakness by 75% on this team. So like the best you're going to be doing on hitting with super effective damage is going to be Psychic, and you have the option of essentially 2 to 4 Psychic users at this point. It depends on the game that you're playing, right? Like, you, in any game, are going to have access, theoretically, to a Drowsy, an Abra, maybe. A Butterfree that could have a Psychic-type move. A Venonat that could have a Psychic-type move. If you're playing on, Leaf Green, where you get the Staryu.
Yeah. And I guess potentially the Execute or the Executor in the Safari Zone.
So yeah, you could run in with the Staryu, depending on what game you're playing. You could get the Execute. You have a lot of Psychic users. I mean, you could even have a Poliwhirl.
Yeah.
Like, there are a lot of Pokemon that can use Psychic. If you caught the Poliwhirl, you could have the Poliwhirl or the Jinx. So you're not wanting for a Psychic user in this game. Chances are you're going to have gotten something that can use Psychic, and you get Psychic for free. So type-wise, there's usually going to be something you can do. So I'd say in terms of his type, it is a little bit of a detriment to him. His type is giving him a lot of very exploitable weaknesses that you're going to be able to do something about just normally playing the game. But like you said, if we talk about his team, like he does have 3 Pokemon who are immune to ground, and the Muck is absolutely terrifying.
Yeah, like, I mean, obviously any of them can set up Toxic, and that could be a real pain if left unchecked. And yeah, I mean, the Muck, especially just because it's so bulky, and if it sets up Minimize, that's a real issue. And even the Wheezing, there's always the threat of the self-destruct. Like, Koga's in like a nuzlocke context, like there's a good chance that like Koga could like take out at least like one of your Pokemon, just like given like the nature of his team, just the fact that he has 3 like explosive users, they all have Toxic, and the Muck can stall. It's like,
yeah, I think no matter what, you can be at risk against Koga of losing a Pokemon. Like, it's never going to be totally free. I mean, unless you have a really fast, really strong Kadabra Alakazam, like, if you don't have that, then it's not guaranteed, even with the advantage, that you won't lose somebody. It might be near guaranteed that you beat him, but there could be a cost to it. And, like, when it comes to, like, your encounters, like we said, like, you're going to have the Psychic types, you're going to have a lot to deal with him, but, like, sometimes that doesn't matter. Just the pure act of playing against Koga is going to introduce some risk to your team. So personally, I'm thinking B tier.
Yeah, I'd say B or maybe A. I don't know. Definitely not C.
Right, he has a little too much potential to wreck you to be put in C. Like, I would vote B mostly by virtue of the fact that like there are so many options for Psychic users, and you get the Psychic TM for free. Like, that does help to trivialize him in a lot of instances. It's just really when your luck goes south that he can do a lot of damage, but he always has that potential. So I personally would keep him in B, but yeah, I mean, depending on the run, there's the potential for him to be worse. So moving on, next is Sabrina, and this is one that I think is a real thinker for me. Just like thinking about her just from the get-go, I'm not entirely sure where I would place her, because Psychic is obviously an incredible type. Psychic's weaknesses, like, in this generation are not particularly powerful. Like, if we talk about dark types or bug types or ghost types, like, you don't have a very large range of options on those types, and a lot of times the best you're gonna have for dark is like Bite on a Golbat or a Blastoise. That's the most representation you're getting from the dark type, and dark being special in this generation makes it a lot harder to use it. So just from a pure type perspective, like, Psychic is not really that afraid of its type weaknesses. Like, you have one ghost type, you have a few dark type moves, and then you have you have like two bugs and maybe one other Pokemon that's using a bug type move, if you're lucky.
Yeah, it is interesting. I do agree, especially because, like, it is interesting compared to the previous 5 gym leaders. Yeah, I think Sabrina's a bit harder to pin down, and yeah, in terms of typing, yeah, Psychic is an interesting type because it's so powerful offensively. Its weaknesses in this generation aren't super potent, but at the same time, it's weak defensively, so you're likely to be able to run her, a Psychic type over with a decent physical attacker.
Right, one thing that I can say about Sabrina is that the Psychic type, I think, is slightly to her advantage, just because of your lack of options against the Psychic type specifically. But if we look at her actual team, I mean, all of them being functionally glass cannons, I mean, she can set up Reflect, she can set up a special defense increase, a defensive increase. So she does have options to weaken your offense against her. But realistically, if you come in here, if you're allowing Gyarados, a Gyarados with strength is going to do really well, basically every time. It might not be perfect, but 1 to 2 strong physical attackers are really going to just help you kind of run through Sabrina while disregarding the type. Like, it doesn't matter that she's Psychic because you're just hitting her Pokemon so hard that they're going down in 1, maybe 2 hits.
I mean, I think it is just, her team it's just linked to the typing. I mean, the Venomoth is weird being there, but it's essentially like a Psychic type in terms of, it is a glass cannon.
Right, so like, you have a very simple strategy, but it's not to say that can't go wrong. Like, there are definitely, the Alakazam can kill anybody.
Yeah.
Like, nobody is completely safe against an Alakazam, and I believe it has Calm Mind, right? So
yeah, I think her Kadabra too, like.
Yeah, her Mr. Mime has Calm Mind. So like, if any of them aren't killed in one hit, there's the possibility for them to set up, and they're all pretty fast. Like there are possibilities to just be completely swept by Sabrina if you're either unprepared or unlucky. So even with the fact that you have a very simple game plan, so does she. So like, there are plenty of times where like I've gone in against Sabrina and I've had the plan laid out, but like it just doesn't work as well as you'd expect it to, and she still is just doing such massive damage that Pokemon that you thought would be safe are not totally safe. You end up having to do an unsafe switch, and if she sets up during that time, things can snowball really quickly. So Sabrina is a really potent gym leader, even with some of her glaring weaknesses.
Yeah, and in terms of encounters, I think, like you said, like, what you'll have access to in terms of, like, psychic weakness isn't going to be all that strong, just because, the dark type, there really isn't dark representation in this game, and the type itself is limited by the fact that it's a special attack. Bug isn't all that powerful yet, and Ghost is, Haunter and Gengar are at risk by being poisoned, but a Shadow Ball, Raticate can always get the job done, I guess.
That is fair.
But like in terms of just broad encounters, it's kind of like Koga, except Koga I think has obvious more direct weakness, just because all of his Pokemon can just be hit by a Psychic and go down. Whereas with Sabrina, I think it's just the fact that you have like probably decent counter. Like aside from the Venusaur, like your starter is a good option. Having like a Pidgeot or a Fearow, and the Gyarados, if you're allowing the Snorlax, you're likely to have something strong enough to probably one-shot her team.
And at this point, you're going to have finished Silphco, right? So you also even have the option, if you're taking the Lapras, of just a really strong defensive tank.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there are a lot of options to at least weather Sabrina's storm. And then beyond that, you can teach Shadow Ball, you can have a Gengar, you have your starter in most cases. Like, you usually have a pretty good slew of encounters to at least approach Sabrina and do your best. Whether she runs you over from that point is a little bit up to chance and a little bit up to like your strategy, but you're always going to be going in with at least a decent team. Like, I don't think there's ever a situation where your encounters are the real problem when you're fighting against Sabrina. So I don't know, like, if we're to think about all of that, like, she feels almost a little similar to Surge, but like with better encounters. So she's in line with Koga to me. But I think she is a little stronger than Koga at a base level. Obviously, she has an Alakazam. I mean, really, the Alakazam and the Kadabra are stronger than anything on Koga's team. With that in mind, for me, it's very strong B tier or a weak A tier for Sabrina.
Yeah, I do think A is the better fit. I think,
She just has such outrageous damage potential.
Yeah, just the potential, like her killing power is just so much greater than Koga and Brock that even if you have a decent team and you have decent Pokemon with decent moves, like an Alakazam could just snuff one of them out.
It doesn't take much for an Alakazam to ruin your day.
Yeah.
So I think I'm pretty comfortable with her in A tier.
Yeah.
So if we move on to that, there's Blaine. I think he is a little easier than Sabrina. The fire type obviously is good, but limited in this game. He has two lines of Pokemon and 4 Pokemon total, all of which are pure fire types. So he's not running much in terms of diversity. And from just a pure type perspective, you have ground types, you have water types. You're going to have something that can counter Blaine. If you really, really need to, you can catch a Tentacool on the way down to Cinnabar. So like no matter what, you are at least getting to Cinnabar with a Pokemon that can deal with Blaine. So I don't think the type is ever going to be an issue for anyone playing a Nuzlocke. I think like the type is, if anything, a detriment to Blaine.
Yeah, the fire type is decent, but especially just from the Nuzlocke perspective, water types are like the most abundant type you can, the abundant Pokemon type you can get in a Nuzlocke, just because there's usually, there's so many water routes, you get the fishing rods, you can fish in towns. You're pretty much always guaranteed a Gyarados at any point in the game.
You will have a Gyarados at Blaine if you want one.
So
And unfortunately for Blaine, he lives on an island. When you get to him, like you have at least like 3 water types that you can catch right there, maybe more. Like he is surrounded by encounters that he is going to be weak to.
Yeah, it's honestly kind of insane, just like how powerful the water type is in this game, and just how in a Nuzlocke, like how easily it is to obtain them. because
Right,
you
like-
get, I mean, I'm not even like, obviously just like the fishing and the surfing is, but like, if you're playing with like gift Pokemon, like you can get a fossil for a guaranteed rock type, the Lapras. You can even get a Vaporeon, which is an amazing water type. The fact that you have Surf, one of the best moves in the game.
Yeah, depending on your rule set, if you're allowing all types of encounters, you can get to Cinnabar with no water Pokemon, and then fight Blaine with a team of 6. Like, depending on how you do, you can go get the Lapras, you can go get a Vaporeon, you can catch 3 water types or more, and you can just fish in towns, and you just have a full team that's just going to run right through him. Now, that isn't to say that Blaine is a total... I mean, it's not to say that Blaine is free, because for everything that we've said, if we look at his actual team, Arcanine is very strong, and Fire Blast is also very strong. I think that if you're playing safe, and if you're being a safe Nuzlocke player, and you have created your team with Blaine in mind, there's almost no way that you wipe to him, even if everything goes south. I think that Blaine is a very, very hard encounter to wipe at, but it's not... There's no way... I mean, it's not guaranteed that you're not going to lose somebody to a Fire Blast or a crit Fire Blast. Like, that can take somebody out even with a type advantage.
Yeah, like, his team is not that incredible. I mean, the Arcanine is the threat, just because it's fast, it's decently tanky, Fire Blast, extreme speed. But, like we said, you're pretty much guaranteed to have coverage for his team.
And even with a normal team, like, even if you're not pumping yourself up with water types to fight Blaine, there's a good chance you have a ground type. There's a good chance you have a normal type with a ground type move. Like, there are so many opportunities for you to have something that's just going... If you have the Doug Trio, you can probably Earthquake Blaine's whole team, and there's a good chance you just win. Potentially without taking any damage, like, depending on your Doug Trio.
And at this point, yeah, you can buy Dig and give it to as many Pokemon as you need.
Right, like Dig is basically, they're giving it away at the department store, so you're not in any desperate need. Like, you're not wanting for options when you're at Blaine. And the things that he can do in return to you, while a Fire Blast can ruin your day, a lot of times it's maybe because you misplayed or something just went really wrong, and then you switch into the next Pokemon and you beat him. I find it very hard to imagine a situation where you're really wiping the Blaine. Like, for perspective, like, there is a time, Mike, where you beat Blaine with only grass types and it took you like 3 attempts.
Yeah, I was gonna bring this up when we talk about, the analysis, but yeah, like, I don't know if you want to just go into it. Because, like, in terms of encounters, I think we already kind of discussed it with just, like, the water typing. Like, there are a lot of encounters you'll have this point, and so many that you likely can build a team of 6 for Blaine.
Yeah, I mean, the encounters, there is just such a variety of encounters that you can have throughout the entire game leading up to Blaine and directly before him. There's almost no situation where you can't build a team to fight Blaine. So I think the encounters are heavily, heavily skewed in your favor. The type is also skewed in your favor. And the actual fight itself, I mean, it's incredibly simple. Blaine is almost always just going to go for Fire Blasts. Like, I very rarely see him do much else. Even against water types, like, there's not much else he can do.
Yeah.
Like, it's his best option in almost every case.
Yeah.
So while that can be scary, if you've got a fast Pokemon or just someone that can tank any Fire Blast, like, he can't really do anything to you. So I think taking all of that into account, I think Blaine is an easy C tier.
Yeah, like, yeah, as someone who has personally done a grass monologue, the fact that I was able to beat Blaine with an all-grass team, and the fact that my Venusaur was faster than his Arcanine shows that, Arcanine, like, it's a good Pokemon, but
It's not insurmountable.
yeah, you're likely to have, something, if not multiple things that, like, can go toe-to-toe with it, and that's the only real threat that he has, so...
So I'm sorry to say, Blaine, but you are bottom of the barrel. I said that Erica was the easiest, but honestly I might have spoken too soon, because I think the end of the game, in terms of gym leaders, does kind of ease up on you with the amount of Pokemon that you have, and depending, like, Blaine might be a little easier than Erica.
Yeah, I think so. Just, yeah, I mean, just the power of the water type, It's just unfortunate that, yeah, Blaine's a fire type gym leader and you can just spam Surf.
Yeah, this is kind of a situation if you get to Blaine and Surf goes whoosh, and that's it. So I think we can very, very solidly put Blaine in C tier and move on to Giovanni. So what are your first thoughts on Giovanni, Mike?
Well, the ground type is okay.
It's just okay.
It's just okay. It has weaknesses. It has strengths.
It's what we could call a type. I think the biggest, I mean, with ground, it's like ground is a great type in moderation. Ground is an incredible type to have on your team, but Giovanni does get unfortunately hindered by the fact that his whole team is ground type.
Yeah, like ground type is an amazing secondary type.
Right, like nobody can argue with a Nidoking, like nobody can argue with Earthquake, but
And especially in in this generation of Pokemon, like ground type is a great secondary type, but to have an entire team composition of ground, there's some obvious weaknesses.
it opens you up to some very, very obvious and very easy counterplay. Like it's so easy to build a team for Giovanni.
Yeah, I mean,
Honestly, in almost every case, you don't need to build a team because you just did
well,
for
yeah,
Blaine.
like just the fact that Giovanni and Blaine have basically the same weakness. The fact that you can steamroll Blaine and then just steamroll Giovanni right after.
Right, even if you're playing with level caps, the level difference is only 3 levels. And realistically, if you have a team suited to Blaine, you probably don't even need to grind if you don't want to. You can just fight Giovanni and wipe him with Surf. Like, there is very little Giovanni can do against the water type. Any water type that you have, like there's nothing that he can do that's going to one-shot you. Even if he's faster, like you're probably tanking hits. If you were able to get the leftovers at this point, like you were just cruising through Giovanni. Like the type is really doing nothing for him outside of it's so strong offensively but so weak defensively that he's never able to get the benefit. Like he is never able to get the benefit of the type. So I think the type is to his disadvantage. And if we talk about his team, it really is not much to write home about. He has 2 Rhyhorns, which is not great.
It's not great.
Doug Trio is good, but if you outspeed the Doug Trio, it is so weak defensively that it's such a glass cannon that it can't really do anything to you. I think the same can be said for the Marowak. At the end of the day, the only threat that he has on his team are the Nidos. And even that is like, a Nidoking is generally going to die to a Surf. A Nidoqueen maybe she'll survive, but like there's nothing that the Nidos are going to do to you that you can't survive and then just kill them with the second Surf.
Yeah, like his team, aside from the Rhyhorn, like the Dugtrio, the Nidoking, and the Nidoqueen are decent Pokemon, but in the context of this fight, especially in like a Nuzlocke where presumably you're playing safer and you're team building, like just as long as you had a competent team for Blaine, you're likely to just copy and paste and goes right into Giovanni.
Right, I said it last time, but Surf does really just go whoosh on these last 2 gyms. You don't have to do much preparation. There's not much he can do. His Pokemon are good, but they're good in isolation. They're good in moderation, and he is not moderating.
He's all
on the
in.
ground type. He is all in, and it makes for a very easy gym battle. I don't even think there's much more to talk about in terms of strategy or anything, because the strategy is just to lead with your fastest Pokemon and use Surf. If you have a Starmie, that's probably game for Giovanni. So all of that considered, I think Giovanni also unfortunately falls into the C tier as a gym leader. Like I think it's even hard if we were to, for whatever reason, take into account his former, like his battles as the Team Rocket boss, I think there could be a case to bump him up to B tier, because you do fight him sometimes when you have less options. But as a gym leader, you have so much that can just absolutely destroy anything he's going to send at you. I think that he fits pretty comfortably into C tier.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, we've touched on this, but like pretty much almost anything that we said about Blaine applies to Giovanni. Just the fact that you're so late in the game, you're likely to have a lot of encounters. A lot of them are likely to be water types.
The most we can say is that Giovanni and Blaine are really, unfortunately, just are screwed over by their placement. Like, they're placed at the end of the game, and you have had so much time to just gather strong Pokemon against them. Like, a Blaine or a Giovanni that you had to fight as the second or third gym would be horrifying.
Yeah.
They would be very, very scary, but at this point, you've gone through so many water routes, and you've gotten so many encounters. There's almost they pose almost no threat at all. But with that is the 8 gym leaders. So just before we move on to the Elite Four, I just want to recap quickly. Misty is the only S tier that we've had out of the gym leaders.
That's not entirely surprising.
But that means that it's time to move on to the Elite Four. So we're going to start with Lorelei, and I think that this does kind of open up a difference in how we're going to have to approach thinking about this, Mike, because with the Elite Four, you can't switch your team. You're coming in with one team, but you've had access to every encounter in the game. There's an interesting counterplay, there's an interesting kind of interplay there of you've had access to all the encounters, but now you've settled on one team, and whatever one team you've settled on really changes how the Elite Four goes for you. So we're going to have to kind of keep that in mind while we go through where we think the Elite Four members would rank. So if we start with Lorelei, I'll say, she is technically the Ice Elite Four member, but really she is a spicy water trainer.
As all good ice types are.
I mean, the best ice types are water types, but with Lorelei, I mean, she benefits so much from the water type. She's really lucky that in this generation, most ice types were water types because it makes her much stronger than she would have been otherwise. It does open her up to an electric type weakness, which I think is something that you can't overlook because you do get a guaranteed electric type in the form of the power plant. But you are almost definitely going to have at least the option of running something with Thunderbolt, or at least a similarly, powerful electric. If you've got Shockwave, like whatever you're running, you have a very clear path to an electric type, and that does help a lot on Lorelei. So she's susceptible to that weakness. But besides that, she's not bad. Like ice covers for the potential grass weakness. She's covering a bit for fire. So like a lot of Ice's weaknesses are pretty well adapted, like pretty well counterbalanced by the ice or by the water type. So she's not horrible defensively.
And stab ice beam, it's always going to be scary.
It's always strong. Freeze is always
a
terrifying reality.
Hail damage.
Like if the Cloister sets up hail, like there's a lot that can happen in this fight to just make it annoying. And there are a lot of variables that you can't always prepare for. So, for example, I mean, I think your best bets are to come in with ground or electric, or realistically, maybe both, depending on what your encounters have been. Because a lot of those ground types are going to be in danger of being hit with a surf or being hit with an ice beam. So, electric is your best bet. So, she's pretty strong defensively, just from a typing perspective. And if we look at her team, she's got a psychic type. She's got the Lapras, which is going to be scary no matter what. Even the Dugong can take names. I mean, it can do some decent damage to your team no matter who you bring in, because you're not always guaranteed to one-shot these things, even with a strong electric type.
I mean, yeah, her team is decent. Just given what the ice types in this game are. I mean, the big threats I think are the Lapras and the Jinx. Especially just, Freeze is just, a threat with her moveset. For what she is, she has a decent team.
Right, I mean, you have Hail. You have Protect from the Cloister to stall out and to get a little bit of Hail damage. You have Body Slam from the Lapras to paralyze you. There's a lot that can theoretically go wrong with Lorelei, and the more I think about it, the more while you have a very clear answer, it's never a perfect answer. Like, an electric type is not going in there with any resistances to Lorelei's team. So, they're getting hit by all of that. They're getting pummeled by it as they're trying to take these things out. And she has some bulky Pokemon. I think the thing about Lorelei is that she is just very well balanced as a trainer, in that it might be hard to imagine always wiping to Lorelei. She's not the largest threat to just sweep you. But she is a pretty good threat to take one or two of your Pokemon out on your way to beating her.
Yeah, and it's interesting in the terms of a Nuzlocke, because like you had said, the difference between the gym leader fights and the Elite Four fights is that the gym leaders you have the option to team build and to build specifically to counter their single typing. Whereas with the Elite Four, you're trying to build the best team to cover as much as possible against all of the Elite Four members and the champion.
There is no chance to recoup between these Elite Four members, and I think the fact that Lorelei so consistently has a shot to take out one of your two Pokemon and weaken you for the later members.
Yeah, I was just gonna say also, like the placement of the Elite Four members is interesting to like the challenge, because in some games like the first Elite Four member isn't that much of a threat, but in this game Lorelei is a pretty decent threat. She's a decently scary first opponent that does have the potential to take out a member or two, which makes it your whole run harder.
And I think like she just has so much swing potential to just kind of change your strategy. Like there can be times where things go bad enough with Lorelei that you're switching out into a safety Pokemon and something happens to them. And if you lose a Pokemon at this point, like unless it's the electric type that you only brought in for Lorelei, chances are you're losing something that you wanted to use on somebody else. So she can throw a wrench in a lot of your plans just by virtue of her position. I think that she benefits the most from where she's placed.
Yeah, I agree.
Taking that into account, my vote is for a pretty solid A tier on Lorelei.
I do think A is solid for Lorelei.
Yeah, I think there's no way that she dips below A, and at her worst, she can sometimes rival Misty in how much she just screws you over.
Yeah.
Like, a particularly bad Lorelei is a very, very scary thing, because you can just lose everything and you don't even know how it happened. I think A is more comfortable for her, but I think depending on the person, there can even be an argument to place her higher.
I think out of everyone else we've talked about, I think she's, the next contender next to Misty.
The water type is really strong.
Yeah, it's kind of like Misty too, in a way.
She is really a gatekeeper of like if you can get past her, the Elite Four opens up and you can. It's almost like you have to beat Lorelei to even be able to enact your Elite Four strategy at all. Like regardless of the fact, yeah, you need to beat her to fight the others and enact it, but like you have to almost have a separate strategy to get through Lorelei. You have to be ready with backup plans to make sure you get through Lorelei because everyone else has a very solid kind of one Pokemon solution in a lot of cases. But like Lorelei, you might need to use a couple of different people. Like you might need to strategize to get through her to even have a chance at everybody else. So I think she's really solid in the upper echelons. So if we move on to number 2, everyone's favorite Bruno.
Well,
what is there to say about Bruno?
You know what we say about Bruno.
What we always say about Bruno ain't Bruno is, he's essentially, he has 2 Onyxes. Let's start with that. He's a fighting type
some
trainer
fighting
with 2
type
Onyxes.
trainer.
So the 2 Onyxes immediately create a giant hole in his defenses, which are already very weak. Because, I mean, it's the fighting type. Like, he is strong physically and very weak defensively. There is not much he can do to you if you have a really strong psychic type, of which there are plenty. If you have a Jinx, if you have a Hypno, if you have a Kadabra or an Alakazam. A Kadabra can wipe Bruno on its own. Alakazam is just like the cherry on top. Even if you have like a Gengar with Psychic or any Pokemon that's not even getting stabbed, can usually handle Bruno no problem. So like they're just type-wise, there's not much. Psychic is going to be tearing through Bruno because even the Onyxes are generally going to die to a single Psychic if you have a strong special attacker. If you have a Starmie, there is nothing Bruno can do to you. So Bruno is very much, just by virtue of his type, essentially like a one Pokemon. Like one Pokemon is going to be all you need to handle Bruno in pretty much any case, based on typing alone.
Yeah, the fighting type isn't amazing. I mean, it's very similar to the ground type, where like it's good offensive. It has some pretty glaring defensive weakness. It's better as like a secondary typing.
Right, it's something that you want on your team, but you don't want it. I mean, you want Brick Break on maybe like your Blastoise or
yeah,
maybe a Primeape or like a Poliwrath. Like a Poliwrath is a great member of the team because Poliwrath can also wipe Bruno on its own. You can sweep through Bruno with only a Poliwrath. It's a good type, but on its own, it's not doing much for him. And if we're to look at his actual team, I think that's where Bruno gets at least a little bit interesting because for all that we say about Bruno and his weaknesses, his Pokemon are strong, Onix excluded.
Yeah, the actual fighting types, if you don't have a solution for them, are scary.
Like
the Hitmonlee and the Hitmonchan, hit hard, and the Machamp is honestly pretty scary if it gets off bulk ups.
The Machamp is scary with cross chop and
bulk up.
Its ability to do massive damage to you, and it's pretty tanky.
Yeah.
It's tankier than you want it to be. So I think out of all of his Pokemon, like the 2 biggest things about Bruno are that he does have fast Pokemon. If you're not careful, you might be outsped, and things can get a little bit dicey if you're outsped. And his Machamp is not always. It's hard to guarantee you're killing the Machamp in one hit. Like, it really is going to be up to your Pokemon. Have you EV trained? If you've EV trained, probably there's nothing you can do. But if you're just running a normal Pokemon, there's a chance that your Psychic type doesn't kill it. And Machamp can do a lot of damage. A lot of the Pokemon you're using against Machamp are going to be weak defensively. And things can get a little scary if you're unlucky. But I think the Machamp, I mean, when we look at his team, like, the Machamp is the thing that you want to be afraid of. And it's really the only thing he can use to swing the match in his favor. Like I said earlier, you can bring a single Pokemon in and like you basically have Bruno solved. So as long as Lorelei has not messed with that, Bruno is not, he's almost never a threat. Except for when he is, which is just, Bruno is a very, very strange member of the Elite Four in my opinion. But 99 times out of 100, 9 times out of 10, you're going to beat Bruno no problem. You're going to be moving on.
The fact that he has 2 Onyxes and means, he's basically fighting you at like 60% capacity.
Right. The Bruno would be an easy enough fight had they included other fighting types on it. Like, we've talked about this before, and I don't want to get into it too deeply, but I mean, Bruno, there's a way Bruno is better, and it's that he has a Primeape and he has a Poliwrath.
Yeah.
Like, he could have had a better team, and maybe then we'd be having a different discussion, but with the team they gave him and his position in the Elite Four as the second member, and like, chances are you have 1, 2, maybe even 3 answers to him, depending on your team composition. Bruno it's very hard for him to pose a threat to you. The thing about Bruno is that it's actually astounding that a member of the Elite Four could pose as little of a threat as he does. So I would say, taking that into account, we can we can comfortably put Bruno in the Bruno ain't shit tier. But if we move on from that, we have Agatha, who is, once again, I mean, she's interesting in what she has the capability to do to you, but I think that she is pretty simple, all things considered.
I think she's simpler than Lorelei. She possibly has the potential. She might have greater like killing potential, but I think she's easier to deal with. And like in terms of her typing, like
yeah, I mean she is a ghost type trainer on paper, but really she's a poison trainer.
Like just in terms of typing, yeah, like the Gengars and the Haunters are the ghost typing. The rest are poison, and unlike Bruno having like two odd members, like the Golbat and the Arbok, they're more of a threat than the Onyx.
They're better than an Onyx. I think that, I mean, the interesting thing from a typing perspective is that she ended up with a monotype that's of a different type than her focus. While she has this interesting spread of she has the poison types, she has the ghost type, she even has a flying type represented. It just creates an easy avenue for a psychic type to tear through her. The ghost type is alright. We talked about the poison type a bit with Koga, where like it's not horrible, but I mean, if you lost psychic, I guess we should say, if you lost psychic, this might be a little more difficult. But even still, like Shadow Ball is an option. And it's not just ghost types. Like you can put Shadow Ball on a normal type and they get a really great advantage on not being hit by her ghost type moves, but hitting for super effective physical damage, given that ghost is a physical type. So like she ends up kind of in this situation of like, yeah, she can hit hard, but you can hit harder in the same way. Like if you bring in a Persian or Eradicate or any physical attacker with Shadow Ball, it's going to be hitting almost as hard as she is, or harder depending on your Pokemon. Because if you have Eradicate with Shadow Ball, she cannot hit you with Shadow Ball, but you can hit her. And it becomes kind of trivial at that point. I mean, all you're worried about, I guess if we move into like her team, is the Gengars are pretty fast. So speed can become an issue, and I think that's really the only time that Agatha is scary is if she's not outspeeding you, a lot of times you're killing her in one hit. But if she is outspeeding you, things can snowball really, really quickly.
Yeah, it's another situation where, yeah, her typing isn't doing her a lot of favors, and especially, yeah, just the fact that Gengar is an amazing Pokemon, but the fact that Ghost is physical in this generation, it can't really exploit its typing that well. So her actual, like, offensive capability isn't amazing, and her defense is pretty poor, but the only real threat is, yeah, the compounding of, like, status with poisoning and hypnosis and confusion and even like curse.
She can essentially Agatha she can cheese out a victory, or she can make you hurt. And that happens often enough that I don't think that she's a pushover in any way. Even if you have a Pokemon strong against her, she has enough on her team in terms of utility that she might bleed you dry on your way to Lance. The Gengars will always be scary, and Hypnosis is always going to hit more than you think it should. And Toxic is always going to do a lot of damage. So I think that Agatha is like a little, maybe a little less than Lorelei, but in a similar situation of like, if you have the right Pokemon, chances are you're going to beat her, but there might be a pretty heavy cost to it. Like, it might be difficult for you. You might lose some Pokemon you didn't want to lose, and you're heading into a pretty powerful final two after Agatha.
I think she's directly comparable to Lorelei in that, like, you're likely to have answers to her. You know, she can wipe you, but more likely than not, like, if you're not one-shotting her Pokemon, there's a good chance that she can kill at least one or two of them. But I think unlike Lorelei, I think where Lorelei, the fact that you don't have, like, a single great solution for her, just because, like, you know, Electric is your best option, but it's not like, it doesn't one-shot everything she has. Whereas with Agatha, like, as long as you have like a decent psychic type, you're very likely to just wipe her. I think that's what distinguishes them. I don't know if she's A tier, maybe.
I think that this is it. Whereas Lorelei is the maybe S tier on a good day, generally A. I think Agatha might be generally B.
Yeah,
but
potentially
with
A.
the possibility to really make your day, like really like hurt you.
Yeah, and I guess it's fitting that like Koga, because she is basically a poison type user.
Right, she suffers those same weaknesses of the poison type, and while she can, I mean, in reference to the Elite Four, her positioning helps her a bit, and her capability of she can bleed you even a little bit more than Koga can, but she has those weaknesses. I think B tier is it's a really good position for her, because like there are times where you're going to fight Agatha and you're going to kill all her Pokemon in one hit and it's going to mean nothing to you, and there are times where she's going to take out half your team and you're going to go and you might lose the entire run because of it. Like, it's variable enough that I think that she has those highs and lows, that B tier is a good place for her. She has a little less consistency than Lorelei, but a similar amount of power in what she can do to you. And after Agatha, we have Lance. So what are your initial thoughts on Lance, Mike?
I hate Lance. He's scary.
He's so scary.
Maybe that's my Heart Soul Silver Nuzlocke showing, but
Right.
I mean, in this game he's scary. Like, Dragon is, a very powerful type. The saving grace with Dragon is that it's weak to ice, and his Dragonite, which is his ace, is 4 times weak to ice. Chances are you aren't bringing a pure ice type, but you likely have a water type, which means you're just as well off with an ice beam. So you're likely to have answers to his typing. Lance is also interesting because he's, like, the Elite Four is weird where, like, they are monotypes, but, like, there's just the fact that, like, yeah, he has, like, 3 dragon types and, like, the 2 random ones with the Aerodactyl and the Gyarados.
Yeah, his type-wise, he brings kind of an interesting mix in that the Gyarados, once again, it's kind of like Lorelei almost helps you in this way, in that the electric type that you brought in to fight Lorelei might be if you still have it and you feel safe enough to start with it, his Gyarados is not much of an issue, but if you lost that, like, Gyarados on its own can be scary. If you don't have something to directly counter that Gyarados, if you don't have a Shockwave or a Thunderbolt to take it out in one hit, you're already starting with, like, your Ice Beam is going to be doing neutral damage. And if the Gyarados, like, does anything that takes out your Ice Beam user, like, Lance immediately becomes much more difficult, and he's always starting with that Gyarados, so, like, you have a hurdle that if you don't have a way to surmount it, Lance can immediately set himself up to be much scarier than he was when you went into his chamber. So, like, the Dragon typing specifically is a really, really good type, but it's also such a frail type. Like, it totally depends on what team you end up in Lance's room with. Because if you have Ice Beam and you have the capability of using it, the Dragon type is not helping Lance. It will help him on any other Pokemon if he's able to kill your Ice Beam user, but until he kills that Ice Beam user, like, he is not benefiting from the fact that he's a Dragon type trainer. This is, of course, like, we're assuming that you have Ice Beam. I do think that Lance has the benefit of, there are cases where you weren't able to get Ice Beam because you didn't have enough money, or you lost your Ice Beam user, or, something like that happens. If in a case where you no longer have Ice Beam, like, Lance becomes really, really scary because he resists so many types. I mean, chances are you did not get the Dratini yourself. Like, there is, like, if you got the Dratini, that's great. If you have the Dragon Claw Charizard, that can help. There are answers to the Dragon type throughout the game. And besides the Dragonairs, his types all have a secondary typing. A Rock Slide is going to help you a lot. A Surf is going to help you a lot on the Aerodactyl. Like, there are moves that you're going to have that are going to help you against his Pokemon no matter what. But at the end of the day, Dragon is just really strong. But sometimes it isn't. It's very strong and very frail. So I'm feeling really neutral on how much the Dragon type actually affects Lance. Like, it is so variable that there's no one-size-fits-all description of what the Dragon type does for him.
Yeah, and, like, in terms of his actual team, it's interesting because I think, like you're trying to team build. You're trying to build the best team to cover, all of the members in the champion. But, like, I feel like next, like, obviously you're trying, you want coverage for all of them. But I think, like, next to the champion, like, Lance is, like, the one, like, you need to prepare the most for, just because of, like, how powerful his team is. Because, like, the Gyarados is interesting, especially as, like, his starting Pokemon. Because, like, it's almost like, I know, like, Gyarados is weak to rock, but, like, you likely aren't killing it in one hit with a rock type move, especially with Intimidate. So, like, you pretty much need to go in with either Thunderbolt or an electric type to one-shot it. So, like, you have to have that contingency.
This is a case where, like, something like a Starmie or something with a lot of versatility in its moveset, like, the Gyarados is an interesting, almost double-edged sword of, like, depending on the team composition you have available to you, it either becomes a call-out where he forces you to start on his terms. Like, you're going to use the electric type first, and then you're going to have to switch out. And, like, that can be scary if you don't have the right team, and that, like, you're starting with a Pokemon that's not necessarily, like, maybe he brings out the Dragonair, he brings out the Dragonite, your electric type is not doing great against it. Like, he sets the tone with the Gyarados, but, like, at the same time, you can just react to that. Like, if you have something like a Starmie and you're able to afford 2 TMs, the Gyarados is nothing. Like, the Gyarados folds to a single Thunderbolt, and then you've got your perfect Pokemon out there for the rest of the team. It's just interesting that it is so specific to your team whether Lance, like, are you playing to his tune or is he playing to yours?
Yeah, it is interesting that the Gyarados, yeah, it does kind of like set the tone. And like in terms of the Aerodactyl, it's weak to water, to electric, to ice. So if you prepared, you're going to have that coverage. But the Aerodactyl is very fast. It's decently strong, and there's always the ever-present threat of the ancient power Omni Boost. So
Right, like you can never count.
You can't count it out. And then obviously the Dragonite is the big threat with it's so powerful. But even like the Dragonairs, like they're obviously weaker than it, but if they get off an outrage, like that's his team, it's pretty daunting. And especially just the fact that he's the penultimate fight. Chances are, unless you have like a very blessed run, like you've probably lost Pokemon getting to him. So that makes it all
like this is where the positioning comes into play of like, did Agatha or did Lorelei do what they do, and did they take out some of your Pokemon? Like, you don't know what you're going against Lance with, and like Lance becomes much scarier the more that variability comes into play. Like, you go into this Elite Four with a plan for Lance, and if anything happens to that, like it can just become the end like so quickly.
Yeah. So what do you think?
Lance is hard because I don't think, I mean, he is certainly never below B tier. Like, I think at his lowest he's top of B tier, but like I feel like maybe I could feel comfortable putting him at the bottom of A personally. If we're to average out like the average Nuzlocker's experience of getting to Lance, like you never know what they're gonna have against him. No matter how much you prepare, like Lance is always gonna be a hurdle that you have to jump over. Like, I understand that, like, a Starmie, like I said, if you have a Starmie with Thunderbolt and Ice Beam, chances are you're going to one-shot all of Lance's Pokemon. But that's not always going to be the case. And, like, if that were the case, yeah, I could say, okay, yeah, he's a B tier. But I think Lance just has, I mean, he has the Pseudo-Legendary, he has the Aerodactyl, he has the Gyarados. Like, his team is strong enough on its own, I think, for me, it warrants at least entry into the A tier. Especially because he is the fourth member. Like, you have gone through so much already. And then to have this, like, there's a lot of situations where this just becomes impossible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think he's at a minimum A. I don't think he's B.
Okay, so you rank him a little more highly than
I do, and I'm gonna pose, like, is he not S?
I don't think I can put him in S. Only because Ice Beam dismantles him so thoroughly.
I mean, true.
I think it is just that fact of, like, there are situations where you get to Lance and, like, Lance can dismantle everything, but, like, you can dismantle him so easily with one Ice-type move. But, like, he does have answers to it. Like, I get that. Like, the Gyarados can do some damage. Yeah. The Aerodactyl can obviously throw things out of whack.
Yeah, it is interesting because, like, I think the thing that sets Misty apart, that very strongly puts her in S tier, is the fact that at that point you're just so limited that even your best option, the Ivysaur, like, is not all that safe. That's like the context of, I think, why Misty belongs in S. The only point I would make is that, like, yes, if you have you can have answers to Lance, like the Thunderbolt for the Gyarados, the Ice Beam for the rest of his team. But, like, just, like, considering his position as the final member, like, if you lose those answers, does that add, like, an extra factor that might bump him up to S? I'm just posing that out there. I do think A is probably the safest.
I think, honestly, like, your argument does kind of get rid of my, like, maybe he's B tier. Like, I think he's definitely A. I think A. Yeah, A is the lowest that I would put him after that argument. But I think for me, like, the thing that keeps him from S for me is just the fact that, like, there is such a simple weakness. I mean, I guess, like, even Misty has that, I guess, in, like, yeah, an Ivysaur can just destroy her team. But if you get to Lance with that answer, I think, like, he doesn't have what Misty has with, like, confusion and with tanking hits.
Yeah.
Like, he's not tanking the Ice Beam.
Yeah.
At least none of the Pokemon that are going to actually do the most damage are tanking the Ice Beam. Like, maybe you have to sacrifice someone to get through the Gyarados if you don't have a good electric type to one-shot it. Or maybe you do one-shot it with the electric type and you have to sack the electric type to then switch cleanly into your Ice Beam user. I'm not sure. But even in those cases, once the Ice Beam user is out, Dragonite can't survive, Dragonairs can't survive, Aerodactyl can't survive. Like, you're just so cleanly dealing with his Pokemon from that point that I feel like, while it's one of those things of, like, he could be S, if you're not prepared or you are unlucky when you reach him. But if you have an answer, I think like, and that answer is so simple to me, I think it puts him at a more solid A.
I think you're right. I agree. I think, yeah, I think, you know, his placement does play a part in it, but I do agree that, yeah, like if you do, unlike with Misty, because, you know, with Misty, like you don't have Thunderbolt. You have to rely on like Vine Whip, so like that's the risk of like you're not one-shotting her Starmie. Whereas with yeah, as long as you have a decent Pokemon like with Thunderbolt or Ice Beam, like you're probably winning that fight.
Right, like Lance is very variable, and I think like in a way of Agatha and Lorelei, we also should look at like if things go right, if things go wrong for you, there's a good chance you're wiping to Lance, which is scary. But if things go right, he's probably not changing your team composition all that much for the next fight. Like when things go right, you're probably going in, like you're probably killing Lance and keeping your team primarily intact, and you're going up against the champion like without Lance having changed your game plan. Like I think that that's an interesting thing in that like if Lance like really like if you're in a bad enough position that Lance is just working so effectively against you, you're probably just wiping there, and he's not really affecting your chances at the next one. So I think it is just that variability. He's very solid in A tier, but I think it is just A.
Yeah.
And that would bring us to the final member. I mean, we could call him Blue, we could call him Green, we could call him Gary.
Smell you later.
What do we think? I'm gonna be referring to him as Gary. What do we think of Gary? I mean, first up, I'll say he very, very solid team.
I mean, yeah, like part of me doesn't even like want to go through the formality of talking about him. Only because, like, I feel like it's just so obvious that, like, I think, like, he has to be S because he has a diverse team. He counters, like, if you kept your starter this whole time, he literally counters you. And he's, you know, he's the final fight of the gauntlet. So, like, whatever you go in with, whatever losses you sustain, like, you have to go up against his full team.
Right. I think, like, if we take it from the type perspective, I mean, he has a flying type. He has a fire type. He has a grass type. He has a water type. He has a strong earthquake user. And he has a strong psychic type. So like no matter what, you're getting hit with this incredible variety that you are going to have to deal with. That first team that you make to just try to get through Lorelei, you already have to have your mind on what am I going to do against Gary? I need to have something that can handle all of those Pokemon. And while yeah, a Starmie can handle most of them, even a Starmie with Thunderbolt, Surf, Psychic, Ice Beam can't safely sweep Gary's entire team 100% of the time. Like the Alakazam is always there. Like the starter is always there to like potentially throw a wrench in your plan. So like type wise, it's just, I mean, he's got the coverage. Like sometimes he has 2 psychic types depending on which starter you had. Sometimes he's got an Arcanine or a Gyarados. Like those are just incredibly powerful Pokemon that you're always going to have to be dealing with. And every step of the way, you've been potentially losing Pokemon and like making this battle harder. Like this battle would be hard with could be hard with a full team of 6 because also the AI is just like better on Gary. He'll switch Pokemon out. Like he will make strategic plays to like counter the Pokemon that you send against him. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. Like there's not too much to be said. Like it's a hard fight no matter what. And if we were to, if we wanted to, like we did with Giovanni, also look at the perspective of every time you have to fight him through it. Like, he's a run ender at multiple points in the game.
Yeah, like...
You can wipe to Gary at Nugget Bridge. You can wipe to Gary on the SSN. If you're unlucky, you can wipe to Gary in Silphco. So there's multiple times where you're already having a tough time against him as he's building up this team throughout the region, and then you come in at potentially like your most frayed and weakest, and you have to just take on that whole team at level 63.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's a lot to say. It's just, it is interesting, comparing him to other champions even. Like, this ain't modern Pokemon where your rival is your friend. And, like, he chooses the weak starter. Like, he goes out of your way to pick the better starter. He will beat your ass at multiple points in the game, and he is a threat. And, like, even compared to, especially just compared to, like, the other Gen 3 champions, like Steven and Wallace more so as like a mono type champion. Like, you can potentially beat him with a single Pokemon that like Gary has coverage. Like he has a powerful, diverse team.
Right. There is no one solution. Like at best, you're like it's gonna take like 2 Pokemon probably to get through him, and that's if you're in like an incredibly good position.
Yeah.
And this all depends as well on what level caps have you decided on, like what you don't even know what level you're going to be coming into Gary. There's just so many variables, and like if you go in at your strongest, there's still the possibility that he takes the win. And chances are you're not entering Gary's like champion room at your strongest. So I think Gary is above and beyond a very clear S tier. There's really no other place for him. But Mike, I think that's it. The tiers are definitely good, but one last thing we could do is take a quick look through and maybe organize the tiers themselves so that we have more of an accurate representation of where we think everyone is. I think like S tier is pretty easy. I think we just put Gary 1 above Misty.
Yeah.
Because like while Misty can end your run, like they're both ending your run and they're both horrifying, but I think like Gary he's the champion. He has this incredibly strong team. Like who knows what your options are limited to based on who you lost. So I think that definitely puts Gary above Misty. If we're looking at A tier though, personally I'm thinking Lorelei at number 1 in A tier.
Yeah.
She has just this crazy potential to just like swing everything in her direction. And I think Lance is a pretty safe follow-up to that.
Yeah.
With Surge and Sabrina, like, I don't know, what do you think about that?
I do think Surge is higher.
I can agree with that just by, again,
yeah, I think
of...
it is limitation. Just you have less options, you have less powerful options, and you know the risk of status and double team. I think there's just more of a threat.
Straight away for B tier, I'm gonna put Agatha at the top.
Yeah.
I think like same reasons as Lorelei that we discussed. Like Agatha is just kind of a gatekeeper of sorts for the Elite Four. Koga and Brock are more interesting.
I do think Brock above Koga.
I mean, it's again just a limitation thing, right? Like Brock is the first gym leader. Who
knows what you have?
Could have just
like at least with Koga,
could have been unlucky.
You probably have a couple, decent options.
And like C tier, I called Erica the easiest, but talking about it, Erica is definitely better than these two guys.
Yeah.
She's a little harder.
Yeah.
Just slightly more limited, and she has some better status effects that she can inflict on you. I think for me I keep the order the same. And then of course Bruno.
Poor guy.
I'm sorry, Bruno, but why don't you have a Poliwrath? Why don't you have a Primeape with Thunderbolt? Like, get some coverage.
What you could have been. This does seem right, and I mean, we've played Fire Red and Leaf Green a lot at this point. We've experienced a lot of these fights in different ways.
Right, I think we have seen a lot of what these gym leaders and Elite Four members have to offer. So I do think that like you can trust we have at least a bit of a nuanced perspective. We've gone through situations where we fought all these people with a single Pokemon, and like I think this is pretty accurate to the threat that they pose to like in a general way, in a general situation. This is about where I would rank them for the threat that they pose to you. But yeah, either way, I think that's it for the tier list. So I want to thank you for watching. This is obviously our first tier list, so we're kind of messing around with the format, trying to see how we want to do it particularly. So if you have any suggestions or comments or things that worked or didn't work for you, you could let us know. And of course, if you have any like differing opinions, I'm sure there are plenty of people who have nuzlocked these games or even just played them who have thoughts on them. Maybe if you disagree with us, let us know. I think we would both really appreciate any kind of commentary or opinions that you would have, because we really love Fire Red and Leaf Green and like to talk about it.
Thanks everyone for watching. We're just starting out, so be sure to follow us and check us out, and remember to stay phenomenal.